Athens. I am pleased to be here with my colleagues, Professor Mir Abolfazl Mostafavi from Laval University, Professor Antonia Spano from Politecnico di Torino, and Dr. Francesca Noardo from the Delft University of Technology. So today's webinar is organized by our working group. It is working group 2 of Technical Commission 4 on Spatial Information Science. So this ISPRS working group aims to promote interdisciplinary research on geospatial ontologies, semantics, and knowledge representation. And today's webinar is about geospatial knowledge representation and analytics. We have 2 fascinating talks today, which will be given by 2 prominent scientists, Professor Andrés Coupen from San Diego State University and Big Knowledge, and Dr. Andrea Ballatore from the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. After the presentations, we will have a discussion and a question and answering session. You're all welcome to participate, and so feel free to submit your questions to the chat during the presentations, and so the speakers will address them. The webinar will last about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So it will also be live streamed via the ISPRS YouTube channel and recorded. So it will be available for viewing at a later time. So let me now introduce you to the first invited speaker. Andrés Coupen is a professor of geography and co-director of the Center for Information Convergence Strategy at San Diego State University. He is co-inventor of several patent-pending technologies and a thought leader in knowledge analytics, combining approaches from natural language processing, machine learning, and cartography. As a co-founder of Big Knowledge, Dr. Coupen builds on decades of experience with the global GIS industry in bringing analytics and visualization solutions to diverse markets. Today's presentation will focus on spatial intelligence as a marriage of spatial thinking with computational learning and interactive visualization. So, Andre, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Margarita. The first question in any Zoom session in 2022 is still, can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Margarita and colleagues for organizing this wonderful session, to which the only qualification, the main qualification of speakers was they share most strings of their first name. So wonderful job string matching there. And so I also want to thank people who've been instrumental in making the work happen that I'll be showing here today. My co-founder, Sean Ahern, Tommy Martindale from the San Diego State University Tech Transfer Office, and especially George Percival of Geo Roundtable, who has been a champion for some of these technologies that I'll be showing you. So today I want to show you some work over the last 2 or so years, introducing notions of spatial intelligence into the areas of knowledge management and knowledge analytics. The backdrop here is that we like to think we live in a data-rich environment, and you are people talk about data being the new gold. And when you're faced with lots of data, it's quick to jump to action based on these raw data, but you probably want to act after first establishing proper context. So in this case, for example, only one of these is an actual wildfire, the other is a backyard smoke cannon. So probably different actions would be required to counteract these. So what I would argue is what's missing here is context. And if you look at the definitions of context, even just dictionary definitions, lexicon definitions, notions of space, though not spelled out, are rapidly coming through. So in these three different definitions, it talks about settings, it talks about things that surround the thing you're actually interested in, and a frame that surrounds the events. And if you don't have that setting, that surrounding that frame, then apparently, according to these definitions of context, you cannot understand, assess, interpret, and ultimately act in a situation. So then the question is, how do you create that context? Well, there is, of course, this whole area of geospatial intelligence that tries to do that in a series of societally relevant contexts. But it is driven mostly by what happens in geographic space, or at least explicit depictions of these events tend to be in geographic space. But what happens if we consider other spaces? What happens if we drop the geo and think about the multiple spaces on which intelligence can be drawn? And so then we can generalize this to spatial intelligence. And we quickly find that we can, however, learn from geographic systems, geographic representations, like, for example, even an innocent representation of coordinates in latitude and longitude actually still requires further metadata, like, for example, which ellipsoid is being used, or is it in fact a sphere that's being used? Because the difference between an ellipsoidal latitude, longitude and a sphere-based can be as much as 14 kilometers on the globe. And so you need to do that for these other spaces as well. We need to establish reference systems for these other spaces. Sometimes these reference systems come in the form of ontologies. Like, for example, if you look at the attack type or the perpetrators, at other times, perhaps the reference systems, like in case of the weapons here, is even the periodic table of elements or other chemical type reference systems that allows you to infer and predict characteristics, for example, of a material. And so what can we learn here from geographic space when we approach these other spaces? And so I would argue that one of the main ways in which geography can contribute to other types of spaces is the idea that there are many concepts that can be applied to reality. And so one of those is the idea that sometimes we use notions of discrete objects, and sometimes we use notions of continuous fields. Neither is better than the other. For a given circumstance, one may be more appropriate than the other. And now think and compare that to contemporary approaches to knowledge management, where the notion, for example, of the knowledge graph and of ontologies in some people's views is the only possible way of approaching knowledge representation. And if you listen to the marketing speak of some companies, it certainly sounds that way, that if you don't use a knowledge graph, then you're not representing knowledge. But it is just one approach, and there are other approaches. And so it helps to keep an open mind about how we represent reality in our various spatial notions. And if we do that, then we can support what we're used to from geographic space, orienting ourselves in a situation, navigating from A to B in context, while being aware of what is to the left and to the right of it, and ultimately performing analytics in these spaces. So then what are those spaces? So one of those that we're very familiar with is attribute space. Most of what we mean when we talk about multivariate analysis is about attribute space, whether it's clustering, dimensionality reduction, correlation, factor analysis tends to occur in an attribute space. So here we have entities described by n attributes. Sometimes they're quantitative, but they could also be, for example, the words used in a cargo manifest could characterize the location of that cargo manifest in an n-dimensional space. And on the other hand, we have network spaces. And the nodes links come in various forms. Sometimes the nodes are abstract concepts. Sometimes they are concrete artifacts, let's say papers written by someone. And the goal of our analysis is perhaps like in the top right here, to boil it down to a backbone structure. This was a backbone structure computed from about 15,000 papers of big data and emergency management. And sometimes it's a mix of living entities, like in the bottom right, Larry is a pig, and he's a male indicated by the red color here, and is linked to geographic cells. So the yellow circles and the yellow squares are geographic cells where wildlife cameras were set up. So you're looking at a kind of socio-spatial network of wild pigs that wildlife biologists can use to understand the population. And then there's knowledge space. And that's really what we're talking about here. So here we're dealing with the fact that we all are, in our various domains, actors that consume and produce artifacts. And these artifacts are diverse. So to do our jobs, we have to not just read scientific papers, you have to ingest job descriptions, strategy documents, news reports, and so forth. And the problem is that the currency in knowledge spaces are the concepts, but the concepts diverge. The language in which these concepts are expressed may not be shared. So even though everyone on this call speaks English, that doesn't mean that everyone understands the concept of shoegaze, which is a particular musical style, both in terms of sound and performance. And if you don't read Arabic, then you certainly wouldn't know what concept is expressed here in that fourth concept. And we have this divergence. In the domains, we get our certifications, our degrees, and that's where the divergence of languages and of concept spaces really accentuates. So if we look at all these spaces, it's not that they are neatly separate from each other, or that we really have our very special ways of representing knowledge space. Instead, we tend to represent knowledge space mostly in one or a mix of the first three: in geographic space, in attribute space, in network space. And so just like the drug use map on the top right is a mixture of attribute space and geographic space, or the pig Larry sits in this mixture of social space and geographic space. And so similarly, when we represent knowledge spaces, we have a veritable menu of spaces and therefore concepts and therefore technologies, even platforms even, to choose from that we can use to represent and interact with knowledge spaces. And accordingly, our representation of knowledge artifacts and underlying spaces can be quite diverse. Sometimes you have a strictly hierarchical network. Sometimes it's more kind of a flat concept network, as you see in the bottom right. Sometimes it's a continuous landscape. And sometimes we have very much regions, just like in geographic space. So we want to, the way we learn from geographic space, among other things, is to pick up on all the concepts, to treat something like a landscape, not just as an empty metaphor. When people talk about needing to understand the threat landscape, the innovation landscape, the business landscape, you rarely actually see a landscape. So then it's not clear whether the power of that metaphor, including to be operationalized, is truly understood. And so the big question then that we all trying to answer in knowledge management analytics are these: what's coming, what's if you are oops, tells me I'm muted.
It's okay now.
Okay. So we all struggle with these questions because our knowledge ecosystems aren't that well-oiled machines. And so let's look at two domains. One is coronavirus, and the other will be more of a broader sort of query analytics domain. So in coronavirus, we're so used to this kind of representation. Seeing data in a georeference context is very, very common and has been very common. So when I created this snapshot a year ago, this dashboard, I would argue, isn't even that straightforward. There's a lot going on here, but there were 2 billion views with a B. Now, but what about the non-georeferenced space? What about the knowledge space of coronavirus, where conservatively we have at least 100, probably 200,000 items to deal with? These are just research papers. And of course, that's reflective of broader trends in society, where workers spend 25% of their time looking for the right information instead of actually working with that information. And nurses as well, spending 1/3 of their time on patient and the rest on documentation and following protocols. Not that there aren't reasons for this, like saving people's lives in terms of keeping everything clean and so forth. And so our approach here with coronavirus has been to leverage network analysis as well as ultimately GIS platform technology, even though nothing is represented in a geographic space. So here we have a workflow, and what's typical when you try to represent knowledge spaces is there aren't ready-to-use tools for the complete workflow. In this case, we're capturing data from the Web of Science, so we have thousands of papers from it, and then we use this wonderful tool out of Indiana University called Sci2, has an amazing way to dissect, create, analyze, and boil down networks, then move on over to Gephi for the spatial layout, and then move on to ArcGIS Pro for further symbolization. But ultimately, the goal is to not have a single pretty picture, but an interactive tool. So it then moves into ArcGIS Online, the platform. So even though it's a platform presumably designed for geospace, you can use it for other spaces as long as they're primarily represented now in a 2D form. And so you end up with these highly interactive story maps, in this case about coronavirus. And we're going to have a little demo just now where you can see this live. And of course, you can do this yourself as well. But you can also feed, once you have it in this platform type shape, you can ingest that in other applications like ArcGIS dashboards, for example. Now, if we turn the page a little bit, so that was strictly a network approach. But is there an alternative? So this approach is very compatible with knowledge graphs, ontologies, and so forth. In fact, you could, for example, build a raw knowledge graph of concepts in coronavirus from this. But let's turn the page and see if we can represent knowledge spaces more akin to a continuous space into which you can project things. Like, for example, a person has certain qualifications that may or may not intersect with what a job ad is calling for and what a company is looking for right now, as well as where it may develop in the future. Because you're hiring a person not just to do a particular job, but also to grow with the company, grow their skills. And so you need to know where the company is going, and everything has to be aligned. And we would say, what if there was a reference system like latitude and longitude and a common space into which artifacts can be presented? So what we're doing with this platform, BOCMAP, that's the Body of Knowledge Map platform, is we're very much looking back at how geographic representations have worked, what actually made them work, not just what they looked like, but what made them work. And those are reference systems, latitude, longitude, detailed measurements of the body that you're dealing with, like in this case, the shape and size of the Earth, or in other cases, the shape and size of a knowledge domain. Then the idea of multi-scale base maps, not a new idea. Here, a textbook from 1901 that shows what some might call semantic zooming. Of course, none of that fancy technology existed then, but the concepts very much existed. And then you need an inference engine. As I said, it shouldn't be a pretty picture. You should be able to project into that effectively a GPS for knowledge. So for example, taking Andrea's abstract of today's webinar and projecting it into the knowledge space of, say, data science and analytics. And so we've built such an environment, such a platform, and we've started to roll this out to multiple domains. Here it's in data science and analytics, and it works very much like web maps that everyone is working with every day, whether it's Google Maps or other types of slippy maps. So here we're zooming into the business intelligence portion of the data science and analytics map. And what's important is that these are not pretty pictures. There have to be deep domain language models underneath. And so we were pleased to find that coronavirus was in fact already a concept in these maps that weren't even of biomedical domains. So one was data science and analytics, one was the geospatial technology-based map. And it turns out once the pandemic hit, we found that coronavirus was already a concept in these maps. So there's more than just the visual. And that's important, this notion of separation between the reference system and the coordinate system that drives the base map, just like in geographic mapping. And once you have that in place, then you can do exciting things like, for example, gap detection. Here we projected one conference onto the data science map and found there was a donut hole in the middle. There was an absence of coverage of certain areas. And that is what a continuous space representation affords you, not just to represent what is, but also what is not or what could be and perhaps should be. And so you now have this GPS-like functionality, taking 3 conference speakers, projecting them into the same space, and voila, you can see where they overlap or where a third person could add something into the mix. And then if you link that to document repositories, let's say you're interested in a particular job, but your resume shows a hole, an absence of skills, then you should be able to crosswalk to, say, 30,000 skills and find the skills that you should learn about, that you should acquire. There are platform services that link all of this. So, for example, we're using GeoJSON, Slippy maps, and so forth that plug right into, for example, QGIS, even though QGIS obviously knows nothing about knowledge spaces, but actually it does once you use the right platform and API representations. And then sometimes you don't even need a map. Sometimes you operate in the reference system, this high dimensional reference system, and you find out that, for example, AI peaked in 2017 and deep learning peaked in 17 as well, except deep learning stayed at a high level while AI has leveled off at an elevated but slightly lower than at its peak. We've done this for a couple of domains. So, for example, for the OGC, we built the Geospatial Technology Explorer. We've now had users in 82 countries access this app. So let's jump right into a few minutes of demo. And so the coronavirus map, if you've used story maps, you obviously know already, you just scroll. And then you can navigate this space as though it was a base map of some geographic region and learn about. So this is clearly for an educational purpose. At other times, for more research purposes, perhaps you're more interested in the network structure. So, for example, here is a ranking by centrality of these concepts, where pharmacology and pharmacy is the most central concept. At other times, you even use these community structures, which are really just clusters in network spaces, and explore those further. And again, these are all publicly available. Then we have these interactive maps. And we could, for example, take Andreas' abstract here. So I'm just going to copy this. And I'm going to see where he falls. So first, we're going to use this GPS functionality. And so he lines up here in digital media and society. But we can relax this a little bit. The idea that a thing is a discrete location in any space is not always appropriate and sufficient. And so we are relaxing this a bit. So now you see a broader footprint that's basically digital media and society, and how big data is treated or could be treated in organizational, in a societal context. And there are other spaces in which you could do that, for example, in the management consulting or the geospatial technology space. But then finally, what about linking all of this to thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of articles? In fact, this is about 450,000 documents are linked here that you can interactively explore. And yes, you could query. So for example, I could again just paste Andrea's abstract, and there the next big thing in humanities, cultural analytics. So you're going to hear much about this in the next presentation. And here it is linked against 320,000 data computing analytics related articles. But what we're most excited about is actually that now the map itself is elevated to an exploration tool. So for example, I could click in, I don't know, biological sequences, and that executes a query against these 300,000 articles, or here 50,000 science and technology articles. And unsurprisingly, the top match here is an article about BLAST, one of the most impactful technologies of the last decade or so. But you can take this a step further. So one thing, by the way, this means that what spatialization and spatial intelligence in knowledge spaces affords us is you don't necessarily need to speak the domain language. Instead, you can serendipitously discover the language, and just by interacting with the map, then leverage that language. And there are some spatial operators, like, for example, I could do a Boolean intersect between biological sequences and privacy concerns. So I'll just add that into it. And so it rapidly boils it down to basically two papers, and the top one is about DNA and privacy. We have some more Boolean operators here. We also have the ability to draw on the map instead. So you could, for example, draw through the, this is the deep learning area. And it will rapidly query. So you draw to query, a very different form that's very much inspired by what we do every day with GIS and with geographic space in general. And then you can crosswalk to other sources. And of course, the coronavirus is in there as well. So I think this gives you a quick idea of what I mean by spatial intelligence, and how, however, traditions of geography, cartography, and contemporary GIS platform technologies can inform the representation and the operationalization of non-geographic knowledge spaces. Thank you.
Andre, thank you very much for this exciting presentation. It is indeed fascinating how the combination of spatial thinking with computational learning and visualization may enrich existing resources with context and semantics. So feel free to submit any questions to the chat for Andre. I don't know if there are any questions. Meanwhile, I can ask a question. Are, in your opinion, spatial metaphors more powerful in representing big and complex data than other visualizations, for example, semantic networks and so on?
Yes, so my understanding of studies of the cognitive implications of, say, network representations, where a network is represented as a node and link diagram versus point cloud type representations or landscape, is that explicit representation of networks, people actually have a hard time understanding, navigating, especially, of course, once they get very large. Now, the flip side is, by the way, that the landscape metaphor is extremely powerful, especially in the hands of a classically trained cartographer. So the first question, by the way, would be probably what are the mountains and what are the valleys? And I could go into the technical explanation, but it definitely, the more it operates visually and now in the interactive elements like a geographic representation, people will have an easier time sort of buying into it and then letting go of this being a sort of a cute technological artifact and rather a tool for getting work done.
Thank you very much. I don't think there are any questions. Oh, okay. So we have a question. I can read it. This is impressive, but the spatialization depends on the graph layout algorithm. Related things may not necessarily be members in the map. How do you come to an optimal layout?
Right. Thanks, Natalia. So first, it's not a graph layout at all. So that's where that divergence comes between a network space and more of an attribute space. So this is more a high dimensional attribute space. And one difference between this and most graph layouts is the ability to actually project things that were never part of the training set. So none of these 450,000 documents that are exposed here were part of training the underlying model. And so that means, and that's very different. And so the neighborhood relationship, even then, if two papers are mapped here, they're not mapped based on how similar they are to each other, but how their signatures vis-a-vis the reference system and base map compare. But they're not directly compared. So it's not a similarity relationship between things being mapped, but a similarity relationship between things being mapped and the underlying space. And so that's actually what enables us to bridge huge dimensional gaps. So that, for example, the boundaries here are there for really good reason. They indicate that space is being crunched up there, while in the mountain areas, space is more expanded. And that's how it's able to bridge that large dimensional gap. So it's a multi-scale model. We combine multiple natural language models together. Some are coarser, some are finer, and that is the source for the hierarchies that are then expressed in the 2D map.
Thank you, Andre. There are some other questions and comments. So the second one, great talk. Have you published a paper on this topic? I would like to learn more.
Yes, we since patents count as publications, yes. So there is a published patent application, and there are a couple of papers that really laid the foundation of the last 10, 15 years for what I'm now turning into also a product, yes.
So, Andre, is there an export facility for representations at different generalization levels?
Was this typed? I didn't see that. Expert. Oh, okay. Not currently. Currently, there is not. Now we are working on that, and we're working also on giving access to the API in the future, where the mappings onto the space could then be shared. By the way, if you're working with the tool, sharing the state of the app is exceedingly easy. So if you copy the link, this is the current state of the app. If you share that, it will be recreated.
There are some other questions on the
But
chat.
I wonder if we're in terms of time.
I think we can, since the audience is now, asking questions, maybe we can continue to answer for 5 minutes.
Okay,
and then
sounds
we
good.
will have plenty of time for the second presentation.
Okay, so there was something about the distortion measure. So when you query a map, so for example, when I double click in, I don't know, artificial neural network here, oh, I'm in expert mode. In expert mode, it is done by drawing. It uses effectively how well a document fits at that location to filter them. So in other words, low distortion mappings are ranked higher. And that's really the basis for the scoring, is how well a document fits what it's in this case a mixture of locations, because we have a Boolean intersection of a transect and a point. So we're using the level of fit to rank. And I suppose one could, yes, Gennady, I suppose one could, for example, map a sort of an averaged stress overlay. All the documents for a particular layer, like these are 100,000 coronavirus layers. It would be interesting to see the spatial pattern of in which regions does it overall fit well, in which other regions does it fit, but not as well. So you would presume with the coronavirus that in the medical area, perhaps it fits better than in AI area, for example. And that would be interesting to test, yes. How much effort is involved in making such a map? So the base map itself that's very involved. It takes roughly 100,000 artifacts, which we carefully curate, not every individual one, but we select our sources carefully. We use what we call canonical knowledge, canonized knowledge, textbooks, dictionaries, lexica, and so forth. And then it's a pretty intense computational process. And that is an iterative process where there is some quality controls. Basically, how much does the maps make sense? The overlays, that's completely automatic. We can add new sources of data in a few hours into it.
There is another question for you, Andre. How do you deal with scale, detail, and how you define boundaries in this special map?
Right. So the boundaries, the way you can think about it is, for example, the region that's labeled web and mobile. What happens is that region, what binds it is the fact that web and mobile is the unifying theme of that region. And once you cross a boundary here, then, for example, here you see a ridge line, in fact, between GPS and SAR radar and meteorology and then remote sensing. So here's a switch at some point from web and mobile to more remote sensing and environmental sciences. But and then at every scale level, there are these regions. So for example, games is both a polygon region, and corresponding to it is a landscape region, right? So if I select this area here, it doesn't find anything because we already had the previous query. So if I focus on games, now here, right, intersection of games with COVID, basically. So there's a correspondence between labels you see and the boundaries you see and the scale of the landscape features you see, right? So smaller gray labels correspond to finer landscape features. So this, you can see that there's a mountain range here of web and mobile. And then as you zoom in, you start to get into games, and video games are related. In the games section here, you also have spectator sports, while here you would be dealing more with actual video games. So we can actually change the query just by moving this this query geometry.
Okay, maybe we have some time for one last questions, and we can leave the others for the end.
Sounds good. So maybe Paul, the last question. So the contours are, yeah, they correspond to the landscape. So the hill shading you see and the contours completely correspond, and they are there so that we more easily recognize things like ridges in particular, ridges that connect different pieces of the map. Like, for example, here, how open access and online communities is a ridge area between education and the especially the social media area of the map. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. There is another question. We can leave it for the end to keep the discussion going. So let us now move to the second presentation of this webinar. Our invited speaker, Dr. Andrea Ballatore, is a lecturer in Social and Cultural Informatics at the Department of Digital Humanities, King's College London. He was previously a lecturer in Geographic Data Science at Birkbeck University of London and has also worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His current work focuses on how the digital is transforming the geographical spaces we inhabit from the perspective of online content creation and consumption. And his research centers around collaborative projects with several academic and corporate partners, including the Ordnance Survey and Facebook. Today, Andrea will present us the main challenges and desiderata in place representation, addressing the question, is place a model problem or a data problem? So, Andrea, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Margarita. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me here. It was a very exciting opportunity to think about my research and try to draw some common themes across the multiple projects I've been doing in the past few years. And it was great to see how easily Andre was able to map my research, because I actually struggle with that myself. So I'll definitely have to use this tool to find some clarity. Right, so the way I currently frame what I do is cultural geoanalytics, and I see that as a branch of social and cultural analytics that studies the geographical dimension of cultural objects, activities, and interactions. And we're primarily using online data and web sources. This is, of course, an interdisciplinary niche between areas such as geography, geographic data science, that is my background primarily, but also media studies and the digital humanities. In this talk, given the limited time, I'll only focus on two things. The first one is a question whether place exists. So I'll talk a little bit about my thoughts on the usefulness of the concept of place and how we can deal with it in terms of models and data. And then I'll give you an overview, sort of a flyby of 7 different projects that are all related to the concept of place, ranging from physical dimensions of place to the more augmented and digital. Of course, it will be quite fast, but I hope it will trigger some curiosity in these projects. So the first question is a bit of a provocation. So does place exist? This is a very deep philosophical question, and many lengthy, complex books have been written by people like Heidegger and so on. But that's not my expertise. I'm not a philosopher. What I'm interested in is how place can be useful to the context of the geographic data science, and generally to the problem of having to represent the geographical space in a meaningful way. If we look at the literature on in human geography, particularly from the humanistic tradition, place seems to be always defined as something that happens when people assign meaning to geographical portions of space. And I put here an example of one of the earliest meaning mappings where the Babylonian society defined the space around them, defining some portions of it as meaningful in terms of settlements, and mountains and so on. Of course, the main problem we have to tackle is that the way we slice the world is largely dependent on culture and language. And as Smith and Mark stated about 20 years ago, it is entirely dependent on culture and language, how exactly we decide how to partition the world and what kind of meanings we attribute to the world. And that's where GIS, the traditional approach of mapping the space in a geometrical way, becomes problematic or becomes difficult to apply. And I think it's one of the fractures between human geography as a primarily qualitative field nowadays and GI science and geographic data science. And that's kind of the interface where a lot of my work happens. So a few years ago, I discussed with Werner Kuhn the problem of place as a core concept in GI science. When we have to explain what GI science is about to students, for example, who might have a vague idea but don't know many details, do we need place? So do we need to include place as a concept, as a first-class citizen in our conceptualization of GIS, or is it better to leave it implicit and just deal with other concepts that are more easily definable? Well, my argument at the time was that you can find a concept of place or very similar concepts in the vast majority of conceptual models and ontologies, whether we're talking about lightweight taxonomies or more formal ontologies. We often find something that looks like place, whether it's called place or not. It has some shared characteristics. The problem is that when we try to actually formalize it, we often come across a lot of problems, and we find it really hard to do it. And I tried myself for a few months during a summer, and I had to give up. I couldn't actually find something particularly unified and convincing about it. There were just too many assumptions that needed to be made. And in my thinking, this paper in particular really influenced the way I think about place. And in this paper, Ross Burrs and Werner Kuhn and others claim that essentially place is not a core concept. Place does not exist as a concept in GI science or in information science more broadly, but can always be represented using other concepts and harnessing those concepts in different combinations to reach the result. And at the beginning, I was a bit skeptical. Then I thought about my own experience, and I realized that this is probably true. And in my experience, particularly the model of the object model is definitely dominant, and I'll talk about that in a second. So my approach currently to this problem of whether we want to include space or not in our models and also in our teaching, right, in the way we describe, we frame what we do in GI science, is that it's generally useful to have a notion of place, and it's very intuitive. And that's the reason why we find it everywhere. Every time we use an information system, we often find some kind of place concept there. But we should use it in a very lightweight, flexible, adaptive way, without trying to formalize it too hard. Because if we do that, if we try to do some kind of mid-level ontology for place or foundational ontology for place, we come across, or at least I came across, insurmountable problems. And once we abandon the sort of a Platonic form of place, I think it becomes a pretty fruitful and useful notion. In my work, I often end up in this kind of situation where I'm collaborating with people from different areas, and we have some research questions that need to be answered, and we have some data. And there's, of course, a feedback loop between questions and data. And when we start to analyze the questions and the data we have, we want to construct a model that will capture this information in an effective way, always from the perspective of answering some questions. That's something very important that is often neglected, the fact that every model is, of course, useful to a purpose. And when we try to build something too universal, I think we end up in not a particularly fruitful space. And in my projects, we often do this iteratively. So we go back and forth between the model and we construct different versions, and we try to integrate it with other data models and other data sets in our project. And we reach a point where the model is satisfactory. It doesn't mean that is the best in absolute terms, but it does pragmatically solve a problem. When I think about the models that we normally end up using for place, object is definitely king. And the object model is perhaps one of the most intuitive, and we can think about it as this mysterious concept of place as having attributes. And the attributes are typically, most definitions, you find some kind of a spatial extension. You find some physical attributes that can be measured. And that's, in a way, the easy part, because we can use very sophisticated technologies to have good measurements of where things are on the surface of the Earth. But we also have very important social attributes that are culturally constructed, such as names. And most of the time, we're interested in place because it has some kind of, is named, so we have reference to that place. We have affordances, so places would support activities of different kind, and we have social roles, so places acting in different ways depending on the context. And what we want to do in an object model is having some criterion of identity. And when we do that, we always have to include time as well, because place, of course, is not only a fleeting, ambiguous notion, but it's also a very temporal notion, because the concept of place, of course, varies. Places vary over time. And when we use daily reference maps such as Google Maps, we find this object representation everywhere. At all scales, we find objects representing states, nation states, cities, to the level of individual restaurants. They're all objects with some attributes. And I would argue that even when we use fancy multidimensional spaces, vector spaces, and so on, we're still relying on an object representation where every point in that space is an object with some characteristics. Something I struggle with when I work with interdisciplinary teams is to make people understand that you can have an object without the boundaries being crisp. We have an intuitive understanding that an object such as this bottle has crisp boundaries, and they're quite easy to determine. In geography, in many situations, we don't have this luxury. We have objects with vague, fuzzy boundaries. But we do have models for that. People have been thinking about fuzzy boundaries for a long time, and I think we have a lot of really useful models to handle that situation, such as the yoke wide model is a famous one for its conceptual elegance, and also maybe its metaphor. But we also have rough sets and fuzzy logic and many ways of defining boundaries in a more realistic way. Although that's something that in most GIS systems that I ended up working is not done commonly, right? There are a lot of challenges in managing these models and making sure that they work. And most of the time it's a data problem. It's not that the model itself is difficult or faulty, but it's simply a matter of not having the appropriate data. The other way of thinking about place, particularly in the context of neighborhoods or cognitive regions that are very useful when we're doing things like information retrieval, and where we're grouping we're clustering data at the spatial level, is that of a field. So we can think of place as a probabilistic field in terms of its spatial extension. And when we ask people, of course, where downtown Santa Barbara is, we get a variety of responses. We see the concept of social agreement, the fact that place is defined in terms of in a social dimension, and that makes it very suitable for a probabilistic approach rather than having crisp boundaries. Although in practice, as I said, it's quite difficult to use these kind of models, and I've been looking of ways of using this kind of fuzzy boundaries in geographic information retrieval, but it is quite difficult to find the data. Of course, nowadays there's more data available, and this is an example from the same research team a few years later, using social media data to capture whether Southern California and Northern California are, and showing, of course, that it is again a cognitive and probabilistic notion. Right. The third big model, and again, I'm sort of repeating some of what Andre said, is the idea of place as a network. And that is an extremely powerful model. Network science has been going really strong for 30 years now or more. And in relation to complex systems, there have been a lot of breakthroughs across disciplines. And nowadays we have not only good conceptual models to handle networks, but also tools like graph databases that allow us to represent entities as nodes in a network. And we can, of course, represent place that way. We can start from our object model and embed it into a network and use it for many different purposes. And this is nothing new, right? The gravity model has been around for a long time, and understanding flows and relations between places have been a central concern of geography, particularly quantitative geography, since the 1930s. Right. So when I think about these different models, I struggle to imagine a new model that would somehow overcome these models and allow us to formalize place in a better way. So my reaction to this is that, unlike what Mike Goodchild said a few years ago, place can be formalized as long as we define it. So if we deal with a very vague notion that doesn't have enough details, then of course it will be hard to formalize. But once we know what we want to capture, it is possible to use a combination of these models to deal with place. So this is somehow my provocation. In order to show an example, I always like these British statistical geographies that show that we can look at the same geography by selecting a domain, and depending on the domain, we will define place as a meaningful unit in different ways. So we will capture the world around us using completely different groupings and the details, right? The details will change depending on our application and context. So in the second part of the talk, I just want to give you an overview of what I've been doing over the past few years and how this relates to the fact that place has a physical dimension that, as I said, is probably the easiest to capture and is the one that we capture very well in GIS in terms of geo-coordinates in a projected space. We are very good at that. But place is becoming more and more augmented digitally. And when we want to capture something at the social and cultural level of place, we need to look at the augmentation as well. Augmentations that in the past were done through what we call now old media, so books and letters and other expressions. Well, now is done on a massive scale online. And I'll show you some examples. So the first one is a project where we looked at how people litter. Littering is a pretty annoying and, of course, damaging behavior because not only from an aesthetical viewpoint, because it's ugly, but also because it damages the environment really by releasing plastics and other materials. And by using a lot of crowdsourced data, we mapped litter in different parts of the Netherlands, and we studied recurring behaviors and what kind of points, what kind of litter hubs were present in that geographical space. And we found very useful the notion of ifoutoir, of a place as something that exhibits recurring behavior. So that's something very useful when you're studying dynamics, thinking about place as the emergence of some structured spatial and temporal behavior. In the second example, we worked with the Ordnance Survey to help Ordnance Survey customers who are essentially mostly British people who want to explore the environment around them and use Ordnance Survey maps to achieve that goal. And the question was, how do we help them choose their routes, explore new places, and in the context of promoting outdoors activities. We didn't know that the pandemic was about to happen when we started this project. And so the outdoors became extremely popular because people couldn't do anything else, right? So that was well, I couldn't call it a lucky coincidence, but that's what happened. In this project, we started from the idea of abandoning a top-down definition of place that we commonly find in terms of categorizing different environments, for example, urban, rural, suburban, and so on, in a top-down manner. But we try to do it in a more bottom-up way, looking at different data sources, looking at crowdsourced data as well, and making a new classification emerge from the data. And that was quite interesting because at times the categories were very easy to interpret. We're matching some kind of commonsensical notion of, let's say, a suburban space, but sometimes there were very peculiar combinations of objects that were more harder to interpret. And that's, we think, a very promising way of learning and recommending places that has been used in other domains, for example, in music, like on platforms like Spotify or on Netflix for movies, looking at this kind of multidimensional representation of an object and then trying to recommend similar ones or dissimilar ones, depending on what our goal is. The third project is thinking about place from the perspective of the food environment. We define the food environment as the collection of food venues and retail centers that provide food for the local population. And something that has been happening and that has been accelerated by COVID-19 is the fact that the food environment has become more and more online, although it's still a relatively small fraction of the whole purchase of food. That has started to change diet as well, giving more opportunities for particular types of food consumption. And what we're doing in this project is actually thinking about the food environment in relation to place, in relation to geodemography. So thinking about who lives in a certain area, why are these companies going there, what is their economic strategy to be successful, and what are the effects on the population. And in particular, it's quite challenging to find a causal pathway, right? So in this project, it's very important to think about the influence of place in terms of causality. Is the place where we live causing our diet to change? And of course, it is to some extent, but it's quite difficult to disentangle, particularly in a society like the British one that is not as segregated, luckily, as the American one in terms of social class and ethnic groups and so on. Spatially, it is, of course, segregated in many ways, don't get me wrong. The fourth project is about museums. And I've been doing some work on the geography of museums and using new sources of data to characterize where museums are in the UK and why. The angle that I'm adopting in this particular research question is museums are placemakers. So when a museum is opened in a place, often there's the explicit objective of changing that place and creating a focal point. And we know that place is about meaning, is about creating a center of some social meaning and cultural meaning. And we are studying the fact that some museums tend to have a very local geography, and their objective is to represent the local geography to the outside world and raising attention and awareness about that. And this is an example of a coal mining museum that is located near a coal mine in Yorkshire. And the idea there is precisely the fact that that local geography is what matters. The mines are there, the museum is proximal, is near to the mine, and it's projecting this dying community to the outside world. At the opposite extreme, we have global geographies of museums like the British Museum that did somehow the opposite of attracting a lot of objects from the outside world and creating a place in its global reach. So displaying power, particularly the power of the British Empire when the museum was created. And of course, these geographies are problematic because a lot of these objects were purchased in a colonial setting. Right, I know I'm going really fast, but I think I should have enough time. The fifth project I wanted to show you is called Facebook City, and it's about studying place-based groups in London and how people are using Facebook to connect and create meaning around places. So we collected information about more than 4,000 place-based groups in London, and we've been categorizing them. In fact, it's quite interesting how little Facebook cares about the geography of these groups, because they were quite difficult to ground, to actually connect to a specific location in some cases. And what we're interested in here is how Facebook can contribute positively to the creation of local communities and how certain unpleasant phenomena can be contained. You can imagine that Facebook is, of course, interested in this because of the bad press they've been getting for a while now. That's an example of augmentation. So we think of a neighborhood as having some shared characteristics. People would recognize the neighborhood, or at least, as we have seen earlier, at the center of the neighborhood would be a focal point, and then things will be less clear towards the periphery. But how is social media and a generic social media like Facebook changing these relationships? How is it creating place? How is it making place in a new way? Connected to Google, to Facebook, there's also Google, and in this project we looked at searches. We look at the fact that search engines are also geographical, and they do create place. So we say search makes place in the sense that it creates opportunities for engagement with different parts of that place. And when we search for a location on Google, we get a representation that is, of course, biased by Google's interest. For example, Google would be really interested in providing commercial opportunities or providing tourism opportunities and so on. And we studied how people searched for places in Amsterdam, particularly looking at the neighborhood level. And we were able to show different search patterns for different neighborhoods and how that indicates different characteristics for these neighborhoods. For example, residential neighborhoods versus central business neighborhoods versus gentrified neighborhoods that would have a lot of opportunities for shopping, and versus declining neighborhoods that have aging population and less, let's say, investment. And this is another, I think, quite cogent example of how we often don't think about these augmentations when we think about a place, but they do matter more and more. So when we walk around the city, we should always think about how is the city augmented online and how is that influencing what we see around us. I'm almost done. So last but not least, this is another project that I started recently that is looking more precisely in the digital humanities. So looking at media like film. So we started with film, but of course this approach can be adopted to other media as well. And the question was, where are films set? So what is the geography of movies, starting from their production, so the country or the countries where the movies are produced, to the places that are mentioned in the plot. And we have been working with some Wikipedia data, mapping using geoparsing, mapping the references to places in these film plots, and starting to analyze them at the country level, where you can see that, of course, there's a gravity. So gravity is very important because when you create a movie in a country, you have the tendency of creating a story within that country for obvious reasons. But there's also exceptions, and many exceptions to that. And in this case, in this graph, we're showing European co-production, the fact that particularly after World War II, a lot of European countries joined forces to create movies together, because creating movies is very intense, capital intensive. There were a lot of co-production between France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. And of course, something similar was happening in the Eastern Bloc, and so on. So this is just an example of how we can use cultural analytics and thinking about place to shed new light on cultural phenomena. For example, here I put a famous scene in La Dolce Vita, that is, of course, an Italian movie set in Rome that contributed to create a particular imaginary of Rome, particularly predominantly in the second half of the 20th century. Right. So from this very fast overview, I wanted to highlight the fact that place is a difficult notion, is ambiguous, and when we try to make it too formal in an ontological sense, we are probably doomed to fail. But it is at the same time a very lively, a very useful notion to deploy in our research. And I hope that I managed to show you the different dimensions of place, the social dimension, the cognitive dimension, and the fact that nowadays when we think about the world, we always have to include a physical dimension, but also the online augmentation that enrich it and shape it, and will do that more and more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Yes, thank you. This is also a fascinating presentation, and thank you for showing us how online data and representations provide essential information for shaping our understanding of different places. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience.
Yeah, I can see a very good question.
Yes.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Don't we need to extend from place to place and time to dynamic situations, including processes known or anticipated interference of actors and objects in parameter space, etc. Even current markup languages used in digital cultural heritage, like DIC-HAM, allow for such models.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in fact, I was starting from the notion of place in its most traditional form, and even early thinkers about place always included time, because of course we are talking about human behaviors and we're talking about certain seasonality, a certain regularity in the human behavior that of course in space and time. And actually I didn't mention specifically the models you're referring to in digital cultural heritage that of course are already well suited for capturing these different aspects and for capturing processes. And that in fact is one of the things that I tend to do in these projects, that we use the notion of place, but of course is always imbued and embedded into a broader model where we think about processes, we think about agents, and also viewpoints, particularly when we look at semantic aspects. For example, from analyzing toponyms, we always think about agents, semantic agents that created these toponyms and what other agents can understand them. And in the latest example on cinema, it is, of course, I showed you a very simplified diachronic representation, but of course, it's a highly temporal aspect because we're looking at a history of more than a century now, about 115 years. And of course, there were a lot of changes in what people meant by referring to different places, what were the ideas connected to these places and so on. And so definitely a process view and an event view of these domain is useful.
Thank you.
But I think, sorry to follow up, but yeah, I think it kind of, this links is very relevant to the fact that we often don't have a model problem, right? The models are there. The models are quite developed. You know, they're quite advanced, and also in the digital humanities, there's a lot of interest in models that would allow for historical representation, historical gazetteers, and so on, and moving towards more powerful models in that respect.
Thank you. So, Andrea, will you consider a place in the knowledge space inspired by Andre's talk?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Natalia. Of course, when I was listening to Andrea, I thought that some of the domains I'm interested in are, of course, quite prone to a specialization approach. For example, in cinema, I think some people have tried already to look at genre. And when we look at cultural analytics, in many cases, genre is a sort of an obvious pivot point, because we have this huge cultural production in cinema, in film, in music, in literature. And genre is a way to cluster, to find meaningful clusters in this huge production. And specialization is very useful for that. So I was actually thinking, as I was listening to Andre, to the idea of combining our mapping of film in the geographical space to a genre mapping and looking at the relationship between the two. So that's something I'm actually really interested in. Although I haven't worked on specialization myself, you know, I understand the concepts, but yeah, I would definitely have to check out Andre's tool to get some inspiration.
Thank you. So the next question, actually, it's a comment from Paul. Interesting that my former employer, the OVNA Survey, has also moved on its research contract.
Yeah, that was quite nice in the sense that I currently have a research collaboration with the OVNA Survey, and they sponsor quite a lot of research in geospatial in the UK, and they're quite open. What's interesting is that they're not only product driven, which is of course their raison d'être, but they are also interested in research and in more basic research that might inspire some future development. So it's definitely a very nice organization. And in Britain, it's seen as a national treasure. You know, everybody loves their maps and so on. But they have been struggling, like everyone, with competition from a well-known search engine company as well.
Thank you.
I think the last question actually is for Andrea.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, as a PhD candidate who is working on place, I want to know your opinion about functionality. Is functionality a spatial context in defining place? Well, I'm not sure what you mean by functionality, in the sense that there are different terminologies there. Part of the first part of my talk was actually about the fact that if you look at the definition of place across different disciplines, you find a huge variability. And in architecture, in urban planning, in human geography, people would use quite different conceptualization, or in philosophy, of course, people would use different conceptualizations. The closest thing to functionality to me is affordance, which is, of course, another difficult notion to use because it's been semantically overloaded for many years. But it's really this idea of supporting functions. So it's related to what geographers call urban function, right? The fact that certain parts of the city are devoted to certain activities, for example, industrial production, advanced services or transportation and so on. But when we think about place, I think it is useful to think about affordances because it is ultimately what enables activities. And often we're interested in activities. We're interested in mapping and understanding or predicting activities. And affordances are intrinsically and intimately linked that way.
There was actually a first part of this question. I think it was for you, Andrea. In your opinion?
Yeah. Sorry, again, because there's a string matching problem. Yeah, sure. So the question is, why is the main difference between POI and place? Which human meaning converts POI to a place? This is actually a fascinating question, and one of my students has been working on that for a while. And in fact, when you look at ontologies online and vocabularies and so on, often when people use the concept place, they mean something like a point of interest. So there is a sort of a blurred boundary between these two notions. And it is also hard to define points of interest. And in many cases, they're actually not points, right? That's why the term points of interest, I don't love it, because it suggests that there's a point feature that sometimes might be a lot broader than that. I mean, one of the dimensions we've been struggling in terms of points of interest is that they tend to be urban. So in that project I showed you, where we were looking at leisure walks and places in a natural setting, the notion of point of interest was actually quite difficult to use, because it was mostly related to things like restaurants or gas stations and things that are normally used in by companies like Google to provide access to services, right? When we are interested in commercial activities, we want to help people find these places. But in conceptual terms, I find it a notion that is as problematic as place, because depending on what activity you're trying to support, interest changes, right? And it's not necessarily a point. Sometimes it could be a polyline, right? It could be a linear feature that you're interested in, not necessarily a point, right? And that's what we found a lot in that project.
Thank you. If there is no other question from the audience, I would like to ask a question. I was wondering whether these techniques may be used to reveal variations in how different groups of people perceive places or feel about places. I'm not talking about individual differences, but group differences. For example, a tourist versus a permanent resident of a city, or a parent versus a young person who may have different needs and therefore focus on different aspects of places.
That's a really good question, and in fact, there is already some work, not by me but other groups, on this idea of trying to capture different views on neighborhoods. And something really fascinating is that even in a place like London, that is one of the most mapped and studied cities in the world, let's say one of the most data-rich cities in the world, it's quite difficult to get notions of neighborhoods. And you would expect that at this point, somebody would have come up with a good way of extracting neighborhoods for London in terms of for information retrieval or other purposes. But in fact, that's quite difficult because there are either more traditional small-scale studies like the Santa Barbara downtown that I showed, or there are more data-driven big data studies where we take a lot of, let's say, tweets or Instagram posts when it was still possible to take them and try to map, to have a probabilistic map of neighborhoods. But it's often quite difficult to discriminate between users. And again, there was an attempt, there were some really beautiful maps. I can't remember the author name, unfortunately, but that showed the tourist map versus the local map and on Instagram. And the tourist map was, of course, all about the points of interest, the tourist attractions in the city center, and the local maps was much more about local attractions in different neighborhoods, particularly because in a city as large as London, people tend to live in their own neighborhood. They move the friction to move neighborhood is so high and so expensive as well that people tend to focus on their local neighborhoods. But it is a really interesting problem, and it really fascinates me. And in fact, I've been trying to think about a project on neighborhoods in London involving different companies. And there are, for example, real estate companies that have their own definitions of place, right? It's interesting how they want to sell houses and they want to allow people to find them. So they created their own definition of neighborhoods that are actually different to anybody else. So it's actually not only interesting from a scientific perspective, but it's potentially very applicable to many domains. So yes, the answer is, I'd really like to do it. I just need to find money to do it.
Thank you very much. There was also a question for you, Andre, before that we didn't read it. Can I read it now? It's from Christoph. I think we have a few minutes left. It says, thanks, Andre. I remember in the study you described in a paper, you only use the labels without the background, right? What are your experiences with the landscape metaphors? How do people use it to interpret the map?
So I was thinking about how to answer that, and it came to me that it has to do with Andrea's presentation about place versus space. So why is it that people are attracted to the landscape representation and as opposed to just the labels or just networks? And I think it has to do with the fact that you want to recognize yourself. You want to recognize your place in even these abstract knowledge spaces, because in fact you have a place. It may not necessarily be the place that you write about, that you research on, but the region that creates those warm and fuzzy feelings of, oh, I belong here. I know so much or sufficiently about it that I am part of a community of people that know something about this region. Now, there are other places on like these maps of knowledge spaces that you know about, but they don't generate those feelings. And I have the inkling that the landscape is part of engendering that, because it connects the place. It's separated with the boundaries, and the labels enforce that. But you notice on the map, there are also labels that cross boundaries. And so I think the map is part of that place creation in these knowledge spaces, though we haven't tested that, but that's a feeling I have.
Thank you very much. So I believe it is now time to end the webinar. I would like to thank our invited speakers for their excellent presentations and overviews of these fascinating topics. I would also like to thank the ISPRS and especially Technical Commission 4 and our chair, Professor Sisi Zlatanova, for organizing this webinar series. And also a big thank to our co-host, Sai Haran from the ISPRS Young Forum for supporting the webinar. And of course, thank you all for your attention and participation and for making this webinar a fruitful event. So stay tuned for the next webinar in the series.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you.
wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you
organizing
very
this.
much.
And many thanks.
Margherita, maybe Francesca wants to say something? Or not? I don't know.
No, nothing specific. Thank you very much for these nice organizations and great talks. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you to all, also from my side.
Nice to see somebody from Turin, who's my hometown. So
Ah,
pretty cool.
okay.
Now you've talked.
We would like
Thank you very much.
to meet you.
So thank you all very much.